Hey, so don't be mad. For my first ever review on this channel, it might be a bit controversial, but I really did not like Outlast. Honestly, I'm kind of bummed that I have to be so negative. I really wanted to enjoy this game. It's always featured in every top 10 scariest horror games list and got absolutely smashing reviews from what I've seen, so I was pretty excited going in. Only for that excitement to slowly wither away and die the longer I was stuck playing it. And there are a few reasons for that. For starters, the Wait, before we get into anything, a quick word. This entire review is my own opinion. Video games are incredibly subjective, and horror even more so, and you are perfectly entitled to your own opinions. Actually, if you liked this game and think this review is stupid, I'd love to hear it. Maybe don't phrase it like that, I'm sensitive, but I'd love to know what you saw in this game that I didn't, or if I missed something or got something wrong, I'd love to know what I can change and improve in the future. Now, with that being said, let's get into... I'm not very picky with my gameplay. There have been plenty of games I've absolutely loved with less than stellar gameplay, and that's usually because of a great, or even just a serviceable story that keeps me invested enough to keep playing. For reference, I didn't hate Gotham Knights. My standards are very, very low. But this game was just so bland to me. The gameplay loop itself was incredibly repetitive, and the story was somehow equally generic as it was convoluted, which wasn't nearly enough to pull me in. The idea behind keeping the player defenseless to increase the fear factor is definitely a good one, and it totally worked on me. Until the novelty wore off and it became more of an annoyance than anything else. The first section, from entering the asylum to going into the basement for the generator, is by far the scariest part of this entire game. And that, in my opinion, is because of the fear of the unknown. You're in a completely unfamiliar location, surrounded by the clear evidence of violence, yet there lacks an immediate threat to react to. The occasional cheap jump scare might temporarily alleviate some of the tension that's building, but the moment you step back out into those eerily silent hallways, all of that tension comes rushing right back in. And then, of course, there's the payoff.
Little pig.
That was good. Not only is that a phenomenally constructed scare, but it also serves to put the player in an even more unfamiliar situation. Up until that point, the player was totally in control of where they were going and where they wanted to be. You chose to climb in through the window, or jump up into the vent, or continue walking through the library despite the giant piles of bodies everywhere. But now you're in an unfamiliar floor, in a big, open, vulnerable area, where the once comforting, warm lights now feel more like spotlights that highlight your every move. You now have no choice but to explore this building even deeper, putting yourself in more and more vulnerable situations to try and find a way out. And that's a really good setup. It's also in this opening sequence where the player learns how to use the main gimmick of this game, the camera. Unlike many other games in the genre, Outlast does not give you any weapons to defend yourself with. All you're given is a camera. And this is a genius mechanic to add to a horror game. Being encouraged to watch the horrors that you're experiencing instead of running away or hiding is a great way to keep the player in the moment and make those scares hit twice as hard. A dying man in the library told you to find the security room to open up the gates, so that's what you do. You make it there without much interruption, and the power goes out. Worse, that huge, hulking beast from earlier is back, and all you can do is hide in a locker and pray he doesn't find you. I really like this. This teaches the player that they're completely defenseless, as well as introducing the hiding mechanic and taking away your main source of comfort, light. Being forced to rely on the night vision camera to see while you make your way down the once familiar hallway and into the dreaded basement is engaging and layered in its fear. It forces the player to leave the safety of the locker and take action, despite the fact that you're at a significant disadvantage. So far, the game has done an absolutely fantastic job at introducing all of the mechanics and making the player feel incredibly unsafe, despite the fact that it hasn't actually thrown them into the deep end yet. And then you actually get into the basement, and Yikes. In order to turn the generator on and restore power upstairs, you have to find 3 separate levers hidden throughout the basement, and flip all of them first. I'm gonna skip around a little bit here, but there's nothing necessarily wrong with a collection puzzle like this. Most horror games sort of revolve around this same gameplay loop. The only issue with Outlast is that that's its only gameplay loop. Yet pretty much every mission in this entire game boils down to flip 3 levers to open this door, or find a keycard to open that door. It gets really, really repetitive. Back to the basement. After you find the first lever you need to flip, an enemy is triggered to start patrolling the surrounding area. You're encouraged to sneak around the basement, hitting all of the levers without being spotted by the man chasing you. I, however, sort of just ran through it as quickly as I could, hitting everything in sight. That might have just been a consequence of me playing in normal mode and being less scared of death because it took 2 hits to kill me instead of 1, but the stealth just feels a little weak at times. Once I found the 3rd lever, however, something interesting happened. See him? Do you see him? They can check in That's right, enemies can randomly check lockers. So far, all we've been taught is that enemies are too dangerous to fight, and you have to hide in order to be safe. But now hiding isn't safe either? Immediately, this sets up the idea that you are never guaranteed safety. No matter what you try to do, you always have a risk of being caught. It's good for the horror, but it's also good to encourage players to get creative with how they deal with different situations, forcing them to step out of their comfort zone in order to avoid getting caught. So far, everything I've been talking about has sounded pretty great. The issue comes in when you realize that that's all this game is. It's pretty much just a glorified, extra edgy walking simulator split up with half-baked stealth segments and collection puzzles. And none of the collection puzzles seem to have much variety between them either. Stylistically and gameplay-wise, they're all pretty much the same thing. Having the only real mechanics be a camera and hiding severely limits what the player can actually engage with, which leaves all the heavy lifting to be done by the story and the horror, and those aren't great either. This was definitely the biggest disappointment for me. I scare incredibly easy, but I also really love horror. Being scared by something fictional is just so fun and fascinating, and dissecting it to find out why it's so scary is almost as fun and engaging as the fear itself. Recently, I've been trying to get into more horror games and starting off with all the heavy hitters, so I was really excited to play this game and see what all the hype was about. So many people described this as the scariest game they've ever played, and I just can't see it. After that first section I described, the novelty of the horror really wore off for me. The rest of the game just felt like they were trying to tick all the scary boxes and throw as much objectively horrifying imagery in my face that it all just came off as try-hard and broke any attempts at building a good atmosphere. Horror is an incredibly subjective medium, so things that I find scary might not be scary to other people, and vice versa. That being said, I don't like shock horror. At least, not on its own. I think shock horror has its place and can be done incredibly effectively if there are other forms of horror added on top of it. Outlast, to me, is just pure shock horror with nothing else added to it to enhance the fear value. Aside from the very beginning, all of the attempts at building an atmosphere later in the game just feel more like set dressing than an actual attempt at horror. If it managed to keep the tense atmosphere going throughout the entire game, the shocking visuals and horrifying imagery might actually be more effective instead of losing their magic half an hour in and never gaining their footing back. I'm going to be using Resident Evil 7 as a comparison here because, for starters, I love that game and want an excuse to talk about it, but also because they're fundamentally similar games. First-person POV, normal guy main character thrown into horrifying situation, stuck in a tight building of psychos that you're supposed to sympathize with, occasional dismemberment, the list goes on. In RE7, the atmosphere starts building even before you step out of your car. The opening cutscene introduces the mystery, and the top-down shot of your car lets you know that you're in the middle of nowhere, likely too far to receive help when something inevitably goes horrifically wrong. You're then directed to walk down a winding path through the Louisiana underbrush. The calming music and warm sunlight contrast beautifully with the small clues scattered around that let you know something just isn't quite right. Now compare this to the opening of Outlast. The intro cutscene lacks the same emotional impact that Mia's messages do in Resident Evil. You're driving down a road that could pretty much be anywhere, explained the setup through a background dialogue, and instantly tossed into one of the most objectively scary places you could ever be. It doesn't take much to make the setting of abandoned asylum intimidating. Now, that's not to say a scary setting is a weakness. Again, the opening of Outlast is the strongest part of that game. The walk through these cramped, claustrophobic hallways as you're sitting there in limbo waiting for something horrible to happen is by far the scariest part of that game. The issue is that the setting becomes far too much of a crutch. Outlast relies on its objectively scary premise and spam of loud jump scares to try and catch the player off guard or make them uncomfortable. With every loud, in-your-face jump scare they play, the atmosphere dies and they have to build it back up, and every time they do, it becomes less and less effective. So what's a horror game to do? Well, a great way to pull a player back in and catch them off guard is to surprise them with something shocking. I know that sounds exactly the opposite of what I was just saying, but hear me out first. Going back to Resident Evil 7, after Mia shows up all zombified on the staircase and you have her big fight, the guest house isn't really scary anymore. Sure, you still need to figure out how to get up to the attic, but you have an axe now, and the game has already shown you that you can defend yourself. Except, you can't. She shows up again, and this time you don't even get the chance to try and fight her before she pulls an Evil Dead and cuts your hand off with a chainsaw. Only you don't get cool chainsaw hands, you just get left with eerie silence and a pool of blood. This scene is effective in a lot of ways. One, it immediately gets rid of the idea that the player has any kind of power. Yes, there's combat and you can defend yourself, but you're pretty much helpless against whatever forces are working against you. If the game wants you to lose, you are going to lose. Two, it gets rid of your hand. That sounds obvious, but it's actually a very bold move, especially so early on in a game's runtime. Usually, in video games, when you get injured, you can just heal yourself. Hell, 10 minutes ago, you just doused your wounds in a random fluid you found inside of a rotting bathroom. But this? For now, at least, it's permanent. The shock doesn't come from the brutality of it. The shock comes from breaking away from the status quo of what we've come to expect from games like Resident Evil. Now, let's go back to Outlast again. There's a section where you have to run away from a bunch of enemies, blocking doors behind yourself and jumping through windows to escape. You eventually reach a dumbwaiter where a seemingly friendly voice tells you to get inside if you want to live. You do, and...
Oh, you're in the right place here, buddy.
Oh, god damn it. You quickly find out that, much like everything else in this game, he's not friendly. You're promptly tied to a chair, rolled through the building, and after a quick monologue from the doctor, get 2 of your fingers cut off with a comically large pair of urinal scissors. Is this shocking? Absolutely. Was I surprised? Oh! Oh!
You paying attention?
Oh shit! My fingers! Clearly. But that doesn't necessarily make this a good scene, nor do I think it's a very good usage of shock horror. It's only shocking because of how visceral and violent it is. The moment you're out of that room, you pretty much forgot that you lost your fingers for the rest of the game, actually. The reason the chainsaw scene in Resident Evil works is because you weren't expecting it. After everything that Outlast has thrown at you up until this point, it's honestly more surprising that it took so long to lose any body parts. And unfortunately, the gameplay itself during this section isn't very scary either. It's just more of the hide until the bad guy walks away so you can go find a key that the rest of the game has been doing the entire time. Sure, having him check under the beds was interesting, but it got old incredibly quickly, and he was so easy to avoid. The next chunk of the game is more just running around, retrieving items to open doors, and hiding, which is where my next big problem with this game lies. The enemies in this game are really boring. I can't rely on RE7 as a good comparison here because... but I'll still use the main antagonists, at least. It's my channel, I get to talk about what I want, damn it. The first enemy we meet is a man by the name of Christopher Walker. Now, out of all the designs in this game, his is by far my favorite. I love that his eyes glow when you look at him in the night vision camera, and his face, as Miles so elegantly put it, and I quote, "It looks like somebody tried to fuck start his head with a cheese grater." And he's right. His face is grotesque, nose almost entirely replaced with a brutal mound of scar tissue, lips pulled wide by some twisted imitation of medical equipment. As he moves around, the chains wrapping his arms and legs clink and drag on the floor. He's threatening. Watching him rip bodies to pieces and stomp around like he owns the place is exactly as scary as it should be, but you're also rewarded with a heaping helping of foreshadowing if you stop to pay attention. Design-wise, there's absolutely nothing that I'd change. It's just everything else that I really don't like. As you progress through the game and learn more and more about the horrors that occurred here, your notes grow increasingly sympathetic towards the victims of these horrible experiments. Is what I'd like to say. Honestly, the note where he sympathizes with Walker felt a bit sudden. He calls him a soldier and says he hopes he didn't find another hell after death, which just felt so unbelievably unearned. Sure, we found files that told us Walker was a victim in all this, but that was about it. Beyond that, we're just presented with something trying to chase us around and brutalizing everything else in its path. Last Resident Evil 7 comparison, I promise. But when you see the vision of Jack Baker in the mold and he tells you that they were just normal people, it feels earned. You just spent an entire game walking around what would have been a lovely house had it not fallen into disrepair, slowly picking up the pieces of the lives that had been ruined. There's a football helmet in the upstairs hallway, family photos, a picture of Jack from when he served in the Navy, innocent notes to each other about fixing the house after a storm. Even if you couldn't piece it together yourself, the groundwork was there to reveal that they were truly just innocent victims of a force outside of their control. What did Outlast do? We saw the brutality and the tragedy of many of the patients, but beyond what was told to us in clinical, emotionless documents, there was absolutely no setup for a reveal like that. I'm aware, logically, that he was a victim, but the game did absolutely nothing to get me emotionally invested in that reveal. Moving on from Walker, the next person we meet is Father Martin, a deranged priest intent on using us for his crazy schemes. Martin is fine. His design is fine, his introduction is fine, he's more of a concept that haunts the narrative until his payoff than an actual character, but I think that works from him. Aside from knocking you out at the beginning, he doesn't really serve much of a direct threat. Actually, he spends the whole game painting blood everywhere to give you a path to follow, so he seems almost helpful. The reveal at the end was truly where his character got to shine. Not only is his last appearance so shockingly brutal that it feels out of place even in this hellscape, but you slowly realize he's been leading you astray intentionally the entire time, forcing you into a vulnerable enough state in order for you to be of service to his deranged idea of a god, the Wall Rider. Don't worry, I'll get to that later. That was really good writing, actually. I love how despite the player's inherent distrust, he comes off as helpful, and you don't even realize the extent of his plans until the game is already over. Writing-wise, he's the best character in the game, in my opinion. Next, there's Dr. Richard Traeger. I quite liked Traeger as a character, despite how lackluster his section was. The voice actor did a great job and gave a really intimidating, deranged performance. Actually, all the voice acting was great across the board. Shout out to the voice actors for being one of the best parts of this game. Anyways, Traeger actually worked at the asylum before being investigated for leaking a bunch of classified information, being pretty much the worst guy ever, and subsequently getting admitted as a patient himself. A lot of his story feels like it's only there to be shocking, but it fits the bleak, nihilistic atmosphere well enough. His jovial attitude and penchant for quips played off the horrifying surroundings really well, and he was just a fun character to have on screen, even though he kind of looks like a withered Cecil Stedman. And he's naked. He pretty much acts the same as all the other enemies in this game, but I liked that we were able to kill him at the end. Overall, he was one of the more memorable parts. Up next, we have the twins! Bit of a theme going on here. I really, really hate these guys. And no, it's not just because I'm new to editing and don't know how to properly censor things, though that might be part of it. No, I just think they're incredibly lackluster and anticlimactic. They're introduced pretty early on in the game, right after you get knocked out by Father Martin and wake up in a cell. They talk all creepy and finish each other's sentences like all good horror twins should, but they don't do much besides stand there. You hear them again while scaling the side of the building, then finally you get chased by them in the female ward towards the end of the game. I think they also show up in the theater, but honestly I got through that part so fast I did not notice. Because they spend half of their screen time just talking about wanting to kill and eat you, I expected some kind of big payoff, maybe a cutscene of some kind, or backstory, or a big section where you had to avoid just them. Instead, all I got was an incredibly straightforward stealth section that only lasted nearly as long as it did because I got lazy and tried to rush through it. If you actually do it the right way, it'll take maybe a minute and a half. This led me to the conclusion that the only reason they're here is for the shock. Actually, I'm pretty sure most of the story pieces are here just for the shock factor, but we'll get to that later. They're cannibals, something notoriously shocking and scary, and what's worse than a cannibal? That's right, a naked cannibal. It's just kinda boring. Speaking of boring, it's finally time to talk about my least favorite thing in this entire game. The final boss. What it's all been building up to. One of the first documents you find talks about a man by the name of William Hope, also known as Billy, or the Wall Rider. That's right, the poor patient you read about at the beginning is also the horrifying monster haunting this place. And he looks like that. I genuinely laughed the first time I saw this, then laughed more at how horrified Miles sounded in his notes. God help me. I think I've seen the Wall Rider. What? You've seen an extra from Scooby-Doo 2002? Seriously, this design is just terrible. I don't necessarily think you need a horrifying monster to finish the game off, but I mean, something better than just green ghost could have been nice. I'll get more into the story later, but the general concept is that it's a swarm of nanites the asylum was trying to find a host for, which is why they had to do all this evil stuff, because you needed to suffer a lot to be compatible, I guess, but come on. He's just not scary in the slightest. Nothing about his design, his actions, nor his presence in the story were scary, and it was genuinely such a bummer to end the game on quite literally the weakest design out of the bunch. I'd prefer the naked cannibal twins to this loser. And finally, the main event, Miles Upshur. Where to begin? Miles is a serviceable enough protagonist. He has the same problem that most faceless horror protagonists have, that being a lack of much personality, but he makes up for it with the snarky little notes he scribbles throughout the game. Sort of. Honestly, kinda lost personality as it went on. He was combative and fiery, but that's pretty much all we know about him. It doesn't help that the setup is built in a way that keeps him emotionally separate from the actual plot. You could put any other reporter in his shoes and the story would be exactly the same. None of his decisions are motivated by his emotional investment in this place, because he has no emotional investment in this place. He's just there. The lack of dialogue, even during cutscenes, makes him hard to get attached to. I'm assuming he was kept a blank slate in an attempt for the player to project themselves onto him, but it just didn't really work for me. The most reaction out of him during any of this was the few times he got hurt and screamed or threw up, but that just wasn't enough to make an interesting or even a likable character. When we got to the end of the game, I was kind of sad that he wouldn't make it out, but I was more bummed that all of my effort was for nothing. The ending felt frustrating and unearned more than anything. From the beginning of the game, you know that there's no making it out of the asylum. This game pounds this pessimistic, nihilistic feeling into your head at every single turn, insisting that the world is bleak and awful, and it doesn't do anything to give you any kind of hope that you might actually escape. So when he inevitably dies at the end, I was more frustrated that all of this time I spent playing was for nothing than I was actually sad about the death of a character. I promised I wouldn't talk about Resident Evil 7 anymore. But I never said anything about 8! Spoilers if you haven't played, but RE8 ends a similar way to Outlast, with our bland, faceless protagonist dying after going through so much. But there's a massive difference between them. Ethan Winters is a person. Even in his first game, he has the emotional motivation of looking for his wife, then choosing to go through hell because he loves her so much. 8 opens up with a window into his life. You get to hold his daughter and explore the home and the family he built. Then, despite being permanently scarred from the events of the last game, he dives in headfirst to do it all again for his daughter. When he died, I was genuinely really sad because I wanted him to succeed, not just because I poured however many hours into the game. Ethan admittedly doesn't get much writing, especially not compared to some of the other protagonists in the franchise, but he still feels like a person, and that's in part because of his emotions. Miles just has nothing. He's a completely blank slate. It might have helped if he had some actual stakes in the story or connections to these characters beyond wrong place, wrong time, but I can't wish for any more bloat to be added to this absolute mess of a Oh boy, the story. I don't think I found every file in my initial playthrough, so I went to the internet to catch up on anything I missed, and it somehow left me more confused than I was going in. It's somehow mind-numbingly straightforward and bafflingly convoluted at the same time. Maybe I'm just dumb, but it really started losing me after a bit. I'll try my best to explain it, and if I get anything wrong, please feel free to yell at me in the comments about it. So this guy named Rudolph Wernicke did about exactly what you'd expect an Outlast character to do in 1940s Germany. He founded a company called Murkoff Corporation and also discovered this nanotech entity they called the Walrider, which they were experimenting with to find a host for. After the war, him and a bunch of other Nazis came to America, where he moved his experiments to Mount Massive Asylum, which is where the game takes place. I believe these experiments were an attempt to make super soldiers / sleeper agent type things in order to turn some kind of profit, but I'm honestly not 100% on that. Either way, their big project was the morphogenic engine. The purpose was to find someone, a host, that would be able to control the Walrider and be super powerful. The only issue is that in order to become a host, one would need to suffer a whole lot, which is why the experiments were so brutal. None of the experiments were successful until Billy Hope, who was sold to the asylum by his mom, by the way, managed to become a host thanks to lucid dreaming, I think? Anyways, it went horribly wrong, because of course it did, and the Walrider caused a massive prison break, which led to the asylum becoming such a mess that we see it in during the game. Also, Billy thinks that Wernicke is his dad, so he's using the nanotech to keep him alive, I think? Also a little fuzzy on that part. The game happens because Miles, an independent investigative reporter, receives an anonymous email and goes to investigate. After running around in circles for a while and getting traumatized thanks to Father Martin's terrible directional skills, he meets Wernicke, who tells him the only way to escape is to kill Bill Lee. Miles shuts down all the systems, but because of the suffering he experienced throughout the game, he becomes a host to the Walrider. Wernicke directs Murkoff's soldiers to kill Miles, and the game ends with the sounds of them being torn apart by the Walrider. The end. You still with me? I can't blame you if you're not. As much as I want to enjoy all the crazy complex lore, it all sort of just boils down to evil corporation doing evil things, 3 a.m. challenge gone wrong, cops called. Not that there's anything wrong with that, I've enjoyed stories like that plenty of times before, but because of the lack of substance in literally every other department, it just kind of ends up falling flat. It's like they knew how one-dimensional their whole game was, so they tried to patch the cracks with as much shocking content and convoluted lore in an attempt to come off as more competent. Sounds familiar. This might be a controversial take, as if this whole video wasn't controversial enough already, but Outlast, to me, is just like if the creators of Terrifier tried to make a generic mascot horror game. The gameplay loop of finding 3 levers or a keycard to open doors, the singular item gimmick, the faceless, voiceless, personalityless protagonist that only exists as a vessel to tell a much more interesting story with, the incredibly convoluted lore that's told through collectible documents and notes, and even the main theme being capitalist experiments gone wrong. It just feels like Poppy Playtime to me. Hell, they even had a final villain they spent way too long building up to who ended up being a massive generic disappointment. Now, I'm not trying to say Outlast somehow copied mascot horror or jumped on the Poppy Playtime bandwagon. Outlast came out in 2013, 8 whole years before Poppy even existed. But I am saying it deserves to be criticized the same way. Just because one has a more adult coat of paint doesn't somehow mean it's of higher quality. Whew, sorry for getting a little ranty at the end there. I honestly didn't hate the game nearly as much as this probably makes it sound like I did, but I was also pretty disappointed that it didn't live up to the idea of it I had in my head. A lot of my criticisms come down to that it just wasn't for me. If anyone has any other horror game recommendations, I'd love to hear them, and I might give them a shot on stream. If you've played Outlast, what were your thoughts? Did you like it? Should I try and give the sequel a chance? And on an unrelated note, this is my first attempt at a scripted video, ever, so if there's anything I can improve on, I'd really appreciate the feedback. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and until next time, thanks for stopping in.